We have just a truly awesome panel here, a K Street panel, who can kind of help us sift through what is lobbying going to be like in 2020 with the election year, the presidential election year right at hand. We have Marie Sylla-Dixon. She is Vice President of Federal Government and External Affairs for T-Mobile. Marie represents the company before members of Congress and helps to direct the legislative strategy for both the House and Senate on many different policy issues. Before joining T-Mobile, Marie was the Vice President for Federal Government Affairs at Verizon. Marie manages T-Mobile's relationships with strategic third-party organizations, including consumer groups and think tanks. And she'll have more to say about that as we get on with the program. Also on our panel is Tonya Saunders, who is the founding principal at the Washington Premier Group, a government relations and public policy firm. She is also the founder of Mid-Tier Advocacy, a 501c3 nonprofit coalition that educates the public on policy changes facing small and mid-sized government contractors. These are the folks who are really watching right now and into next year for a potential government shutdown and what implications that might have. Also joining us today is Bryan Zumwalt. He is the Executive Vice President of Public Affairs for the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which is going to be rebranding in the new year. So he's going to share a little bit with us about how he's going to be navigating the election year politics, as well as a new brand for the grocery manufacturers. In his current role, Bryan leads all advocacy activities for the organization, including government relations, communications, search and allied development, research and allied development. He has a proven track record of lobbying, specifically in his work at the American Chemistry Council. So thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate your taking time out of your afternoon. We all know that it's a busy season. And when we sort of look to 2020, I mean, I already sort of feel like we're in a presidential election year. It seems like there hasn't been much of a pause. I mentioned with respect to your client, Tonya, we potentially have another government shutdown approaching. There's just a lot going on. And how do you navigate this? Can you still lobby? Are the folks on Capitol Hill still concerned with issues other than the potential impeachment of the president? There's just so much going on that, how do you kind of cut through the noise? And I wanted to point out, in addition to all of your current roles, all three of our panelists have worked on Capitol Hill. They represent a variety of backgrounds, working in the House and or Senate, Republicans, Democrats. So we sort of have lots of different viewpoints represented here. Folks who went through the last impeachment in the 1990s in some way or another. So I'm going to ask you all about that. But just to start off, and I think Tonya, I'll kick it off with you if that's okay. From your background and where you are currently, are Congress and the executive branch agencies just all consumed with impeachment and the coming elections? Is there any bandwidth, basically starting now and heading into 1 year from now when we have the 2020 presidential elections, is there any bandwidth to move on legislative or regulatory matters?
I believe that as a lobbyist, at least I am continuing to push, um, basically going up to the Hill, doing the due diligence, meeting with staff. Um, we do know that there are several bills that are still pending in the Senate in respect to the appropriations process. You indicated there could be another government shutdown. Well, that's always a possibility when there's such a short time left on the calendar. And currently, we're looking at a very short time frame to finish most of those appropriation bills. What may end up happening again is another continuing resolution or CR. Um, at that time, we might be able to have an impact should they include other items, which we've seen in the past. They call it loading up the Christmas tree, so to speak. so that some issues that have bipartisan support already moved through some of the process
Right. They
can
can
then
hitch
be
a ride.
concluded. Yeah, yeah. So that may actually happen before the end of the year. So we're watching very, very closely on those issues.
Okay. Bryan, from your perspective, you're relatively new to the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing from now into the beginning of next year, and trying to, have members of Congress learn about your new branding, and also while they're busy running for office,
Mm.
and there's this, impeachment in the background, and so forth. So how do you have any examples of how you're trying to get through all of this background?
Yes. So, no, I appreciate the question here today. I think as an organization, we're in a little bit different situation than a lot of trade associations around town. Luckily, we're pretty far along in that process. Simple stuff that I guess I kind of implemented during my time at Chemistry Council. Now we're having to initiate some of the basics of launching a campaign, deciding what the key issues are, assessing where our relationships are on Capitol Hill, what we need to do to develop new relationships, and then what our priority legislative goals are going to be starting in 2020, really, and moving beyond that. We're real focused on the relaunch, which, as you noted, will happen in the second week of January. One of the things we're going to be doing is an event on Capitol Hill that we're pretty excited about with the rebrand on January 15th. So a lot of our focus is going to be around introducing ourselves as a new organization to Capitol Hill staff and members of Congress, doing that launch at the beginning of January, and then really pivoting to the campaign work and the focus areas we're going to engage, through 20, and recognizing the politics of 2020 are going to be what the politics of 2020 are. But I still think it represents a window in time, despite kind of challenges are with getting things done legislatively. It is an opportunity to meet with staff, meet with members that relatively free time, legislatively speaking, to get to know you and learn about your organization.
So nobody's going to be hiding under their desks for
Oh, no.
for 2020.
No, no, no.
I'm gonna take that question to you, Marie. I also wanted to let all of our listeners know that as we get closer to the last half of our program, we're going to take your questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will get to those in the second half of our program. For you, Marie, can you talk a little bit about the legislative and the regulatory agenda? Does it continue? Will it continue into next year, or do you just sort of give up because there's gridlock, or what do you all do?
First of all, representing my views and not of my company's, and second of all, just Kate, want to thank you and Fiscal Notes, CQ, for having me here today, having this informative discussion. As you think about the 2020 landscape, I think the first thing that does come to mind is, elections is coming up, impeachment is going on. The last time that impeachment happened, it took about 4 months, and that was in 1998, 1999 timeframe. But I do think, there are definitely some must-pass legislation that's going to happen in 2020, and we see the deadline coming up for November 21st, which could possibly be pushed even to the beginning of 2020 if action is not taken. I do think, 2020 does set the stage, although there's going to be controversial legislation that may not get done, more the controversial ones being, prescription drugs or immigration. There are other things that could possibly be passed and be done. And I think, especially if you look at the Senate, you've got some senators, Republican senators that are in some purple states that, need some wins. And then you have, a Democratic House in which, in order to maintain their majority, they're going to have to come to some sort of consensus. So I do think, at the end of the day, the parties with Congress can come together and hopefully can get something done. I think another thing that you're going to see, especially in Congress, but is also, them using oversight when it comes to agencies. Agencies are going to, continue to do rulemaking. They're going to continue to do enforcement. So I think you're going to see a lot of policy making on that end in the different agencies that are going to continue. I will say also that 2020 does set the stage, I think, for advocates or lobbyists for us to be up on the Hill educating members and staff. I think, there's going to be a lot of change in 2021 where you may see a different chairman. There's a lot of retirements going on, also a lot of ranking members. So that's going to provide the opportunity to make sure that, we're up there educating members and staff about the key policy issues for companies or organizations. Because ultimately, when 2021 does happen, regardless if there's a change in the administration, I think you're really going to see the accelerator being pushed to kind of get, legislation done pretty quickly. You may actually see a Congress where you may see possibly even a bigger majority in the House. Possibly the Senate could flip, or even the administration. And I think even if the administration doesn't change, you're going to see, a president who wants to, push and get some of the key big ticket items that were made on the campaign, through, whether it be a new one coming in for their first 100 days. So I think as advocates and lobbyists, it's really important to make sure that we're educating the Hill staff and members and preparing at least for the next Congress.
Can I add something?
Please do,
and
yes.
just dovetail to what Marie said, which is very, very relevant. And I would also suggest to folks in respect to lobbying right now, time is running out to lobby on some of the broad support issues that already have bipartisan support that are non-controversial. My past experience has shown that bills that are just non-controversial, again, tend to move out quickly before they leave because, like Marie said, they absolutely want to get wins, and they'll be looking for wins when they go back home to start the campaign cycle.
They want to tout these on the campaign trail. They
Absolutely.
want to say, look at my record of
Absolutely.
achievement. People on both sides of the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
Marie, you made a good point about, and I know you do the third part, you work with the third party group. So you all are on the Hill getting your, getting your message out, your brand out. You're also looking for these potentially strategic areas of bipartisan cooperation. But let's take it away from the Hill for a minute. And I'll start with you, Marie. Working with these third party groups, think tanks, consumer groups, other industry organizations, what have you. Is that in preparation for 2021? Is that what groups need to be doing all through next year? Is working with these outside organizations to set the landscape, or what are you going to be doing with the third party groups?
So I will tell you, third party stakeholder engagement is really, really important if you're looking at any type of policy campaign. A lot of, for example, members of Congress, and also even right now, a lot of the presidential candidates, when they're looking at different policy agendas, they're really borrowing ideas from a lot of these think tanks, for example, on key issues. Also, healthcare, immigration, taxes, energy, any type of issue. Also, in the role of government affairs, it really has changed. It's still important to go up on the Hill and do that, on the ground education, but it's also important to make sure that you have key validators who are helping to tell the story. So, I work for a company where our issues are all about broadband deployment, 5G, smart cities, IoT, and in helping us tell part of that story, we work with different organizations on these types of policy issues. And they serve really to help kind of amplify the message, but also to help, lend, credibility to the story that we're talking about, which is ultimately what is going to benefit the customers when it comes to, broadband deployment issues or broadband regulation issues. And so I think it's really important that companies, organizations have this outreach and this dialogue with third-party organizations and really pushing the policy agenda. I think it's more so important also in DC just because you're seeing a very populist type of mindset where sometimes business is not always trusted. I think also, for example, grass tops advocacy and making sure that you have, certain thought leaders helping to tell the story does help when you are trying to get the message out to policymakers and regulators. And then I would also say the issue of, grassroots is important too, making sure that you have, not just the third party engagement, but also engagement from consumers and constituents who are speaking up. So, for example, we had an issue a couple Congresses ago on taxation of the internet, and we were able to get a number of our, customers engaged. This was at my former company a while ago, and they were able to weigh in with members of Congress and talk about, the implications of why, it was bad to have the internet taxed and how that was going to impact them from having accessing the internet or broadband deployment and making their pricing go up. So I think it's really important, as you have that advocacy toolkit that you're doing, grass tops and grassroots to kind of get your policy agenda going and help you tell the story.
And in the trade association world, from the Chemistry Council or the grocery manufacturers now, do you also do this? Do you work with think tanks and third-party groups, or are you more the third-party group that companies are working with, or is it both?
Yeah, I couldn't reiterate more what Marie just said. And something we've had to do as an organization is, particularly on the thought leadership front and the research component, we don't have a lot of that expertise in-house. And so what you do and the value those third-party verifiers provide to your engagement, not only with an administration on either side of the aisle, but on Capitol Hill, is provide the research and the expertise that you need to justify and support any of your policy goals. And it couldn't be more important, I think, having that outreach to third-party groups, researchers, people that are viewed as credible around town, even in and outside of Washington, endorse and support and develop the ideas that become parts of your campaign.
You see me nodding my
Yeah,
head.
as a contract
I was
lobbyist, do
just
you
getting ready to,
also? So
absolutely.
this is,
In respect to
yeah.
the clients that I have, I represent Federally Employed Women, which is known by few. It's an organization of federal workers across the country. And we have a very strong grassroots effort on a number of issues like Federal Employed Paid Leave Act, also government shutdown. We activated the grassroots on that. And two, to your point regarding third-party validators, the Organization of Federal Contractors, there's not a lot of data that's out there for mid-sized companies or companies that are growing. Once you expand beyond your small size, you're no longer considered small, so you're in a larger pool of businesses. So Ohio State University, as well as GAO, have done studies looking at that mid-size space, which again helps us tell the anecdotal story. We have the anecdotal piece, but now we have the data, which supports what we pretty much have known, through our own experiences and through contracting itself.
So when you use that data, do you actually have to have some sort of communication with that university, or do you just pull it and use it?
Oh,
or
no,
both?
they actually contacted us. They explained that they were looking at this particular size business, and they were going to include federal contractors in that whole universe of industry of mid-sized companies. And they interviewed a number of the members of the organization and got information from them, their history of existence, how long they've been in business and so forth. So it
You all
was very
were
helpful.
actually working together.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I can add to that. It's funny that we bring this up now because we actually had an internal budget discussion this morning about 2020 investments. And I can comfortably tell you that the probably hottest part of that discussion was making sure we had enough money going into research and partnerships. Because that's really where nowadays in modern
That's where it's
advocacy,
at.
that's really where the value is if you want to be effective inside Washington, inside the Beltway. And so it was just an important, interesting part of that discussion because we probably had a 2-hour meeting on budget, and at least 30, 45 minutes was on the research component.
And another thing, Kate, we really can't talk about lobbying in 2020 without talking about political positioning. Large corporations, even smaller businesses, are ramping up their PACs right now so that they can begin to contribute to candidates that they, that their ideas and their issues align with.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of that around town.
That's a really good segue into our next discussion because there, business PACs have been, kind of maligned on the campaign trail. This really started in the 2018 elections. You saw a growing number of Democrats. I think we're over 50, 55 sitting members of Congress, House and Senate, all of them Democrats, I believe, who will not take PAC money from, most are just, corporations or businesses, some even to trade associations. So for you all, for Marie and Bryan, both of your organizations have PACs. How are you navigating what has become a really toxic political environment? Does your PAC sort of stand down in 2020 or not at all?
So I would say that PACs don't stand down. I think the biggest thing in navigating the PAC is making sure that you're communicating and you're educating members of the PAC. At the end of the day, the PAC is really, it's the employees who are giving the PAC. It's not the company, it's the employees who are really giving to the PAC.
Right.
And
That's a
making
good
sure that-
point. These
Yes.
corporate PACs,
Yes.
quote unquote, or trade association PACs
Absolutely.
are the contributions of the employees
Yes.
and sometimes and other there's certain people of a certain class who are allowed to donate. And the company can help put on the events with its money, but other than that, the donations are actually coming from executives at the company, sometimes their families. It's not corporate treasury that's giving out
Not at
the
all.
donations.
Yeah, and
They're
there are a
prohibited.
lot of strict rules that go along with the PAC in terms of, who's eligible to give to the PAC, and it's voluntary. And I think the biggest thing for companies and for ours and in the past is, it allows the employee to be part of the political process and engaged. So, for example, we do a PAC newsletter. We sometimes have, we have a PAC director who puts on great events to engage the members of Congress so that, people who are members of the PAC can actually meet the members on both sides of the aisle. And it really allows them to be a part of the political process. And I think the second part is, the part of the education of the PAC is also making them aware of what government affairs departments are doing. A lot of time in some companies, there's a disconnect that not every company is based here in DC. A lot of companies are based at headquarters outside of DC, and they aren't aware of, the policy issues and how that's impacting the bottom line. So if you have that education, just to make sure that you educate members of the PAC and employees, on what's going on in DC on the policy side of things, it helps make them feel like they're a part of, the PAC and a part of that engagement.
Well, and sometimes you have to let them know, why are you giving to Democrats and Republicans?
Exactly.
As most
Absolutely.
business-oriented PACs, they usually are somewhat evenly split. There are some exceptions to
Very
that, but
similar to the
many,
country, maybe.
many are 50-50, many are 60-40, depending on the makeup of Congress. So I bet you hear some questions from the people who are eligible to donate. Why, why are we giving to such and such Republican, or why are we giving to a Democrat? So that's part of the education that you're mostly saying you have to keep in communication with your own employees.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think if you're transparent about it and you have that open communication, I think it tends to make people feel a lot more comfortable. And at the end of the day, when we're up there, we're not wearing a DR&R hat. We're representing the company or the organization at the end of the day in the interest of the industry. And so I think it's important to make sure that, when you're having that open communication, that you're conveying that message to the employees, and it makes them feel a lot more comfortable. But I think the transparency and the communication is something that, again, employees like, and they appreciate that at the end of the day.
And you have a different, your member companies, executives and so forth that can give. You do it following a similar path, and are you finding it difficult where there are people who won't take the PAC money, or Are you going to continue to ramp up into this 2020
So-
election year?
I'm waiting for that
So
answer.
no, you're gonna love this one. So it's hard to overstate the value of a PAC as an advocacy tool when you're an organization in Washington trying to make its heard. And I'm coming from an organization. I've been over at I keep wanting to say Consumer Brands Association. We're almost there, but GMA for about 2 months, and I went from a $900,000 PAC at ACC, roughly a $900,000 PAC, to about a $50,000 PAC.
Wow.
So part of the rebuild component of that is really re-engaging not only staff within the organization, but the member companies as well to explain the importance of a PAC, because really what it is an advocacy tool is something that buys you time. What you're using those PAC dollars for is to buy an amount of time to present your issues or just show your support or to build a relationship. Just generally speaking, it's a tool it's an additional tool to have your voice heard. Washington, D.C.
And so when you rebrand, is it January 1st as?
Yes, but we say January 1st, but the website will be up. We anticipate the 13th or 14th, and then our Capitol Hill
Okay.
kind of
As the
will be on
Consumer
the 15th.
Brands Association,
Yes.
and part of what you hope to do is build up that PAC.
Yes.
And so the opposite of sitting it out. You're going there. Okay.
For us right now, goal number one is building the PAC to reflect really the size of our.
Okay.
Kate,
Tanya,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
Nan.
no,
I
please go
wanted to
ahead.
bring up one thing that you did raise, which a lot of folks think, it can be a challenge, is the 55 members who aren't taking PAC money. One thing I just wanted to bring up, there are other ways to engage those members, for example, leveraging, the facilities, site visits, in the members district, and using those as in part of the advocacy toolkit as well to try and tell the story. I think a lot of times some members appreciate the fact that, um, when you're talking about policy agenda, but also recognizing that all politics is local, and that as part of that, a lot of them, a lot of us have facilities, or our members have facilities in their district that they
Right.
can go and visit, or, for example, doing, Hill Day fly-ins with employees who are constituents of members coming up to DC. So there are other ways to engage those members who don't have a PAC. So it's becoming on us as lobbyists and advocates to kind of get, creative and how to do that. So.
Bring their constituents who are also your employees
Exactly.
to their attention.
Exactly. And especially, I can't stress enough the employees, but also, the fact that, a lot of us have facilities in the members' districts or headquarters. That's jobs, that's economic growth. And that's part of the story, that you're telling, with the member. And it helps to connect the dots. I think if you have, a policy issue, if you're talking about taxes, if you're talking about, manufacturing or trade, and you're able to connect that back to their district, I think that there's a real appreciation for that.
You're agreeing,
Yep.
Bryan.
Absolutely. We refer to it as the political mobilization component. That's really connecting the dot between the member and his or her constituents in the district, where that's a fantastic tool. You have a facility or a member company, in our case, a member company that has a facility, able to get them time with their constituents to meet the people that are working there. And the people that they're hoping will show up when it's time to vote. It's very useful.
So Tonya, as an outside consultant, kind of switching gears a little bit, are you noticing that your clients are either wanting to pull back, they don't want to lobby in the 2020 landscape, or are you finding that they do want to remain engaged because they're concerned about being sort of a political, a hostage or political football in all this chaos and drama? What are you finding from the client perspective?
From the client perspective, no, they are still engaged and they want to remain engaged because the landscape is changing so quickly. When you pull back, you tend to lose the ground that you've already gained, so to speak. So you want to stay involved. During that time, just as Bryan and Marie indicated, there are a number of other things you can do, become creative. A number of the larger corporations, for example, during the 2020, in the past, my experience has been they begin looking at the conventions for the parties and developing, you know, whatever events they're going to host. So you have all of these activities that continue to go on, and it's still in that same vein of engagement, if you will.
That's a really good point. And since are you all looking at hosting events again to get your brand on you know politicians' minds, lawmakers' minds at the conventions? Is that part of what you're going to be doing?
There may be somebody else in the room that has a little more resources than
Okay.
we do right now. You know, it's something we'll take a look at, but it's generally speaking, it's not sure it's something this year, but something we'll look at.
But that is
at
an
its appropriate
opportunity
juncture.
Oh,
for
absolutely,
branding. I know.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And also those very large industries. I've worked both for very large business as well as some of smaller ones and smaller trade associations. So I appreciate what you're saying. However, platforms, the party platforms, how do you impact or influence the dialogue? We know right now healthcare is a large issue for all of the Democratic candidates. And a number of, I would assume, healthcare industries are looking at that very closely, watching to see as this field of candidates begin to narrow where the shift is going to occur, or is it going to be a very broad Medicare healthcare opportunity, or are things going to be more narrow, more incremental approach? So they're lining up right now. That's not going away. I mean, in respect to other issues, tax, trade, we can go down the line. Marie mentioned immigration. Some of the other issues also to be concerned with and to pay attention to, of course, infrastructure, which has been hanging out there forever and hasn't had anything yet happen
We're still waiting for
significant.
Infrastructure Week to materialize.
Absolutely. But again, there are industries that are impacted either by the action or the inaction of Congress on those issues.
I have a question for both of you, Tonya and Marie, because Marie, I think you were
Mhm.
on the Hill during
Yeah.
impeachment last
Mhm.
time.
Oh, Lord.
You were
I know.
downtown, kind of
Yeah.
newly. Just real quickly, can you give us a sense for whether is it going to be similar where you think lawmakers will continue to be working on these parallel tracks, or do you expect some bit of shutting down the legislative movement?
I mean, I'll tell you, when I was on the Hill during impeachment, I mean, like I said, again, impeachment took 4 months. It took a while, but there was still members of Congress that were able to work across the aisle to get things
Absolutely.
done. And it didn't stifle, you know, the legislative agenda. The member that I had worked for, there were a number of initiatives that our office was able to get through legislatively. I do think now it is a little challenging just because of the environment that we're in. I'm hoping and I'm hopeful that, you know, at the end of the day, members will, you know, come together to get things done inside the Beltway. I do know that outside the Beltway, there are things going on at the state and local level. But I do think, you know, we're just in a very, very different era right now with the use of
Right.
social media,
Mhm.
which wasn't, you know, we didn't have that around back in 98, 99. But I am hopeful that, you know, hopefully, you know, impeachment won't take up the whole entire agenda. I think members are committed to getting something done because at the end of the day, I think their constituents, you know, want something to be done.
Um, I agree. I think right now we're in uncharted waters. We haven't seen anything quite this visceral, either when I was on the Hill or off the Hill in the early years. During those years with the Clinton impeachment, I recall working on an issue for Eastman Kodak at the time, um, before the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee on, of all things, telehealth, which actually passed. It was included in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. Also, during that time frame, President Clinton started working on the Balanced Budget Act, and he had, as a House held by Republicans under then Speaker Newt Gingrich. And they wrestled and wrestled for several years, actually, on this one issue. But it finally passed in 2002. So I say all that to say, I hope that we will see a few of these, legislative issues passed out of this particular Congress. I believe we do have good, dedicated members on both sides. I just hate that we're held by the larger dialogue right now, whereas if you do reach across the aisle, then you're perceived possibly as an enemy of, you know, the of the moment to the other side. We've got to find a way to bridge some of these gaps. And if I can suggest one, I think, and I've heard other members say they wish earmarks would come back because it helped members to compromise on things. I also believe they need to sit down and go to dinner and become more civil again. We just have to start talking to each other and not just at each other.
Bryan, from your perspective, this is a little bit different topic, but on the presidential campaign trail right now, we see a lot of proposals. They're not legislative text. We've seen proposals on that address lobbying among Democrats, lobbying, political money, as well as healthcare. It really runs the gamut. How closely do you scrutinize these proposals, or do you wait until there's a Democratic nominee and then they're in a general election and you really start to look at this, or how much do you take seriously what's these outlines on the campaign trail for the presidential candidate?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think is hopefully other people in this room would attest. Politicians on the campaign trail, particularly during presidential election year politics, what they may want to say or present doesn't necessarily reflect reality. It certainly doesn't reflect reality before 2021. Again, and it also doesn't reflect reality before you even narrow it down to who the nominees are going to be the final. I would suggest that I think the next 3 months are going to be super interesting. Maybe really the next 4 months. And to me, the three big ticket items are USMCA.
That's the new NAFTA, the new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada.
The new trade agreement. Does that go to the floor during the middle of the impeachment process in the House? And on top of it, we're about 15 days now from the shutdown. So CR expires on the 21st. My guess is that they come to some sort of short-term agreement. They've got Thanksgiving break the week after that. They've got to come back for 2, maybe 3 weeks. And essentially during that 2 to 3 week process, the House needs to figure out what it wants to do with impeachment, figure out USMCA, and figure out funding the government into the new year. Then when you get back in January and February, the Senate has to eat up a couple months, probably at least a month, on impeachment. And all of a sudden it's March. We wake up and it's March, and maybe none of this stuff's happened. Maybe nothing happened. And all of a sudden you're into election year politics where who knows what kind of promises are going to be made at that juncture. But it's really, I think, the focus for the next 4 months is how do those play out, and then assessing what's reality and what's not.
Bryan, you just outlined the timeline. That really is it for people that are listening. That is the timeline. March is over.
We have several questions, and I also have some other questions, but let's go ahead and I'll just start off. These are some of our questions from listeners. I'm just going to start at the top. With so much gridlock at the federal level, are your organizations shifting focus to things that could be done at a state level? And Marie, I think you sort of started on that there's a lot going on outside the Beltway. And I think, Bryan, you also are looking at packaging, with plastics and things like that happening at state and even local levels. So do you have any advice on how organizations can advocate for issues at the state level? Anybody want to chime in on that?
Absolutely, I do. Given that Virginia has now just turned blue, there's a huge push for the 38th state, which could actually be Virginia, in passing the ERA, ratifying the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. So there's a coalition, the ERA coalition, and our organization, my client's organization, Federally Employed Women, are a part of that organization. And there is a strong grassroots right now in Virginia to get that ratification done. So I would think taking steps at looking at the legislative makeup,
Yep.
determining what issues could potentially pass based on who now holds power. I've heard also possibly reasonable gun laws in Virginia. There are also some, I believe, some discussions around legalizing marijuana in certain states. So you may actually see some of the associations that are located here with their membership located in these various states pushing at the state level in addition to what they're pushing up here.
And depending what a specific state's political makeup is or partisan makeup is, some of it might be defense, right, Bryan? I mean, you might be looking at things that you don't want to see enacted in a state. So is there a defensive posturing as well?
There's both defensive and offensive posturing, but this is one of the discussions we had. Most of our member companies, we had a meeting here about 3 weeks ago in Washington. One of the biggest focuses and concerns amongst our member companies is how we were going to handle advocacy at the state level. Because I think it's kind of a misnomer that things aren't happening in Washington or the dysfunction in Washington means nothing's happening. You have all these regulatory agencies, all these commissions, all the departments within the agencies that are constantly working on regulations, guidance. You'll never run out of work to do in Washington. But that doesn't mean, as you pointed out, that the states, in response to the perceived inaction of Washington, part reality but part perceived inaction in Washington, aren't going to be aggressive in terms of what they want to do, both legislatively and from policy perspective. And so we are constantly looking and reevaluating how we can expand our engagement at the state level. I think it's critical.
And I would just add that I agree with what Tonya and Bryan just said, but I think also, at the state and local level, in the state houses, and also even with the mayoral and the counties, they're becoming very, very active on issues that may not be happening at the federal level or just issues in general. So, for example, the telecom tech industry had privacy has been a big issue that we've been trying to get, done at the
Like
federal
California
level.
has been.
Exactly. And so California went ahead and did their own legislation. And so you're seeing a lot more members at the state and local level becoming more engaged with issues that they think aren't going to be accomplished at the federal level. And I think you're going to tend to see more of that. I also have been seeing kind of a lot of engagement at the state AG level on a number of policy issues where they become very much activists on issues. And I think you're going to continue to kind of to see that trend taking place. And then I think one part of the question you had also mentioned is, organizations inside of DC, like there's a lot of, for example, the National Association of Governors, the National Conference of Mayors, the National County of State and Elected Officials. I mean, they have a DC presence as well. And so they have, become even much more, influential at the federal side in helping, to push the policy agenda. So that's another way. I know a lot of companies like ours, we have, advocates at the state and local level, but it's also important for us to engage with some of the organizations that have organizations inside the Beltway who are weighing in at the federal level as well.
The third party stakeholders. I just want to, I know obviously T-Mobile is going through a merger right now. Your company, I mean, your association is going through a reorganization and rebranding. Apart from those kind of very specific to your own organizations, are you reassessing your lineup, whether it's federal or state or even international, because of the 2020 elections and what's happening on the campaign trails? Or is your personnel sort of separate from the political winds?
I think all organizations kind of go through an assessment. And yes, after, elections, it's a normal thing. I think for us, it's not necessarily about ideology. It's about, the skill set, who can represent the company, who has, the substantive background on some of the key policy issues. But I would also say that an assessment is probably done, all the time by companies, throughout the year, just to make sure that we're, getting the best of the best. And I would also say that in DC, the pendulum is always going back and forth. And
Seems
so
like it.
you want to be prepared regardless of, a change or not, just because, again, you're constantly going to get new members and constantly going to get, new staff. But I think at the end of the day, I will point out something, though. At the staff level, I mean, a lot of times, a lot of staff will, stay on the Hill, or they might go to a federal agency. So it's also important, not necessarily for member relationships, but more so for, the staff relationships, and also making sure that we have, the right firms that have, the substantive background on, our key issue areas. And that's very important.
In respect to that pendulum, it swings both ways on K Street as well. Typically, when the Congress changes over, then you'll find a number of companies hiring up for that particular political party, and some people not being picked up as a result of that. So it's always
So you do expect some amount of turnover over the coming
absolutely
12 months.
yes,
Yeah, okay.
absolutely.
I was going to do another question here from one of our listeners. What advice would you have for those looking to enter the lobbying field in the midst of 2020 politics, particularly those still looking to build their experience? So anybody?
Depends on where they're coming from. If they're coming straight off the Hill, um, it would probably be in their best interest to align their possible new career with what issues they represented while they were there, issues that they handled. 2020, again, depending upon which way the political winds are blowing, could be very beneficial to folks leaving the Hill. As far as people coming straight out of college, I would recommend that they try to go to the Hill because that's where you need to gain the experience in order to be picked up by a lobbying firm.
And I would also add that I think because of the elections and what's going on, you're going to see a lot of turnover, and there'll be, I think, a lot of opportunities for folks who do want to get into the lobbying field. But to Tanya's point, making sure you're prepared, whether it's working on the Hill, whether it's also working at a think tank or at an organization. Sometimes those type of backgrounds of working in organizations and nonprofits really prepare people on the issue areas. And it's also just, again, preparing yourself, having those conversations, sitting down with lobbyists, getting to know their backgrounds, and understanding how, they got to where they are, and kind of having those informational type of interviews. I would say, this is a great town for networking. You have people from everywhere.
Absolutely.
I would also say, even looking at opportunities that may not be federal lobbying, but state lobbying opportunities.
Absolutely.
And just kind of, making sure that you're prepared, because I do think there'll be opportunities later.
I mentor a number of young people, interns that come in and give them real-time experience because I'm a small operator, boutique firm, and they get hands-on experience with research, with going up to the Hill. I try to immerse them in as many opportunities as I can when they're working with me.
Since we're talking about Hill staff and sort of the pipeline from the Hill to K Street, Marie, I think we talked the other day about diversity on K Street and diversity on Capitol Hill. Can you give us a quick reality check about, is that important in hiring decisions for government relations practices and companies?
So I think one thing I'm going to bring up is the lack of diversity on the Hill. I know that it is a huge issue that both the House and Senate, and to their credit, Senator Schumer has taken up this issue. Speaker Pelosi has taken up this issue. They've actually set up diversity offices to help address, some of the lack of diversity on the Hill. And there have been some strides made, I think, especially on the House and even in the Senate. So I do want to acknowledge, some of the work that has been done. But I do think it's really, really important. And, some of these pipeline jobs coming from the Hill that, there are opportunities and that they are diverse, because at the end of the day, when companies or organizations are looking to hire, they're looking for certain backgrounds. And too many times, um, there isn't diversity in a lot of those positions. And I think it's important in a lot of the offices, the government affairs offices, that when you have diversity of perspectives, which is what
That's exactly
you'll
right.
get, I think it's really important. And I think it's important now just because also, you look at the country and how diverse we are, and you look at the diversity of the Congress. I mean, we're the most diverse Congress ever in the history of Congresses. I mean, we have more women, more people of color who have been elected to office. And just yesterday, I mean, there were several firsts that were broken. You had the first, I think, Muslim who was elected in the Virginia State House. And so I think it's important to make sure that you do have diversity of perspective. I can just, speak on, for example, my company and others, a lot of our customer base is very, very diverse. And so I think it's important to make sure that, you do have, diverse perspectives coming to the table, because it makes it's interesting, and it brings a perspective that, that may have been lacking before. So.
And it's economically sound because of marketing, branding, all of the things that major corporations do in terms of who their customers are. If they don't reflect their customer base, then it's harder actually to incorporate the ideas that they need in order to reach their customers. When I was on the Hill, as you well know, Kate, which was a few years ago, we won't say how many, but in the Senate, there were maybe, I would say under 20 in personal offices in the entire Senate. And we didn't even have, at that time, an EEOC office in the event that we had any complaints. I mean, we serve at the will and the pleasure. Now, things have changed, and I'm so excited that, progress is being made and these type of conversations are being had, because it's very important as a country and as business.
I guess the only thing I'd add there is I agree. I think the importance of Capitol Hill leading in the diversity component is critical, because your success in this town, particularly in the lobbying space, can largely be a reflection of your experience on Capitol Hill or in government. That's what opens the opportunities and the windows for you downtown. When you get that experience on Capitol Hill, it's a lot like getting a college degree or going to grad school. Once you have it on your resume, nobody can take it away from you. So that's the leadership there is really an important role in where it needs to happen, open up the opportunities off the Hill.
We're going to be wrapping up in about 5 minutes. So I'll go to another question from one of our listeners. How do you square PACs, companies and groups that give to politicians that don't agree with the company's values? For example, giving to anti-LGBTQ candidates while still sponsoring LGBT events during Pride Month. Are you concerned with that rising trend? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, in respect to a trend, I can't speak specifically to this particular issue, but I can speak to from a historical perspective. When I was lobbying for company Rent-A-Center, we in fact had to square how we were looking at both Democrats and Republicans and determining how the PAC should, and this is recommendations from us, how the PAC should contribute based upon committee makeup, members, and who was in their respective districts. Connecting those dots was important. It may not have ideologically lined up as much with that particular, person in the trade association, but it was important for the overall advancement and education of that particular
Right.
office or member.
And I think you do see concerns about this. There's shareholder activism, consumer activism, where companies have to sort of be cautious of their own brand and their own messaging to their employees. And I think that's what that question was getting at. Another question is politicians are often criticized for not really understanding complex issues like 5G. How do you go about ensuring that members understand, what they need to know for you to be able to make your point? Do you bring in experts
So,
who are on the ground?
So I would say bringing it, not even just bringing in experts, but really tying it back into, how it impacts their constituents. So, for example, we have members that are in rural districts who have, no internet connection, no, not a lot of broadband deployment. So a big issue right now has been, getting broadband deployment in unserved rural areas. And they understand, if they have a wireless device and, their constituents aren't getting service, and you talk about, how 5G is going to be a game changer in terms of the speeds, the deployment to rural parts of the country that don't have any connectivity. You can also tie it back to a lot of these rural members have, our big agricultural areas. So a lot of farmers are using, technology to watch over crops, whether it be drones and other different types of technology. You can also talk about, the impact that 5G is going to have, on things like smart cities or smart communities. So I think in part of the storytelling and educating members is tying it back to the issues that they are most concerned about.
So even
and I
if
think,
they don't necessarily understand the highly technical,
yeah, I
what-
mean, at the
what-
end, yeah,
what-
they understand, not having, wireless or broadband service in their district. And I will tell you, it's a huge, huge issue for a lot of members. I mean, they feel like, no broadband deployment. It's also kind of like it's a civil rights issue as well that, all of us need to have, deployment. And it is a game changer for, consumers to have that, competition in the marketplace as well. And so I think at the end of the day, I'm going to give, a lot of members of Congress a lot of credit. I mean, a lot of them have introduced great legislation, on 5G, have been very active in holding hearings on 5G, and are very interested in seeing, the U.S. become the leader on 5G. Just because also it is an issue of, global competitiveness, that we be the first to deploy, 5G, because again, it is going to be a total game changer, and it is really going to, I think, put us at the forefront.
did you want to weigh in? I think we have about 2 more minutes.
I think you could spend another hour.
Yes,
answering
that's
that
its
question.
own. That's
But
its own
let me
question.
kind of finish with this.
Own
To answer that
webinar.
question, I think this gets to the heart of the issue and relationship with staff. In order to convey a message on a complex issue, one, you have to build the relationship. They trust you. Two, or they believe or that you are, or you're going to provide the subject matter expertise, and that when it's time for them to defend the issue or where you're going, that you haven't led them astray in a way that will undermine their credibility as a
Our reputation and our credibility is what we have, and that comes
number one.
So
Yes,
even
that is
despite what we hear on the campaign trail about lobbyists,
we wouldn't be
You're-
able to do our
you're
jobs
saying-
if we didn't have credibility and a reputation. And I know we've all spent a lot of time building that.
And I think credibility is huge, and it's huge also as a lobbyist that you give staff and members both sides of the argument. I mean, in this town, it's all about, your integrity and, being honest. And when you build up that reputation, I think they come to you and they see you as a resource on a lot of these issues, because not everybody has the bandwidth to, study on, the different issues. And so I think if you're a lobbyist, you can be, a resource to that office. And I think that there is an appreciation for that.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really terrific discussion. We have more questions that we don't have time to get to, so maybe we'll have to do another one at some point. But thank you all for taking time out of your day to discuss
you.
these issues
This has
and
been
bring this
great.
really excellent insight into how you're gonna cope with 2020, the 2020 backdrop as you go forward. So thank you for being here.
Thank
Guys.
you so much.